The whirring of airplanes buzzed in the sky over the ocean. The aircraft carriers were powerful, but they were nothing without these incredible planes and aviators that filled the sky. As the war progressed, they would fall from the sky in droves, and the Japanese dominance in World War II started to wane. Welcome to Fast Facts Friday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, or IJNAS, was the air arm of the IJN. The organization was responsible for the operation of naval aircraft and the conduct of aerial warfare in the Pacific War. Now, the Japanese military would get their first airplane in 1910 and followed the development of air combat during World War I with great interest. The IJNAS can be traced back to as early as 1912, so that's when we will technically say it was established. Initially, they constructed European aircraft under license. However, by the 1930s, they had their own designs and their own factories. At the same time they were building aircraft, they also embarked on an ambitious aircraft carrier building program, starting with the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier, Hosho, in 1922, which we covered just a couple weeks ago. During this time, numerous excess battlecruisers and battleships were converted into aircraft carriers, a good example of this being Issei and Hyuga of the Issei class. As the organization assigned to the IJN's aircraft carriers, the Navy Air Service was tasked with the missions of national air defense, deep strike, naval warfare, and so on and so forth. It retained this mission until its dissolution following the end of World War II. Their pilot training program was extremely selective and rigorous, so produced some A-plus pilots that served for a very long time. These pilots were incredibly successful during aerial combat in the early part of World War II. However, as combat continued and casualties started mounting in 1942, the long duration of the pilot training program combined with a shortage of gasoline for training prevented the IJNAS from rapidly providing qualified replacement pilots in sufficient numbers. Moreover, Japan, unlike the US or Britain, never altered its program to speed up the training process of its recruits. The resultant decrease in pilot quantity and quality, among other factors, contributed to increasing losses of aircraft and aircrew toward the end of the Pacific War. Just like their Army counterparts, Japanese naval aviators preferred maneuverable aircraft, utilizing lightly built but extraordinarily agile planes, most famously the A6M-0. The Zero achieved its extreme maneuverability by sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Aircraft with armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, like the Kawanishi N1KJ, didn't enter service until late 1944 to 1945, too late to have a meaningful impact on the outcome of World War II. The IJNAS was a huge part of the Pacific War, and we'll look at why. If you're enjoying this episode and want to hear more about ships, their careers, and their wrecks, check out our main show Shipwreck Sunday every Sunday night at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Okay, let's get into World War II. For historians, World War II's true beginning is sometimes considered July 7, 1937, which is also the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, where Japan would invade China. However, tensions between Japan and China had begun long before this, starting with the Shanghai incident. In January of 1932, clashes between Chinese and Japanese forces occurred in Shanghai. On January 29th, several aircraft from the seaplane tender Notoro, anchored in the Yangtze River, carried out low-level attacks on Chinese military positions in Jia Bay, striking artillery positions outside the city and an armored train at a railway station in the northern part of the city. There were heavy civilian casualties and destruction of property, partly as a result of the crude bombing techniques and mechanisms in use at the time. The Third Fleet, consisting of the 1st Carrier Division with the carriers Kaga and Hosho, was also dispatched to the city. Kaga arrived at the mouth of the Yangtze River on February 1st, and she was joined by Hosho just 2 days later. On board Hosho were 10 fighters and 9 torpedo bombers, while Kaga had 16 fighters and 32 torpedo bombers. Altogether, the Japanese had 80 aircraft that could be deployed over Shanghai, mostly Nakajima A-1 and 2 fighters and Mitsubishi B-1M3 torpedo bombers. On February 3rd, a number of the aircraft from the 2 carriers were deployed to Kunda Airfield, and here they flew missions in support of Japanese ground forces. Aircraft from Hosho participated in the IJN's first aerial combat on February 5th, when 3 fighters escorting 2 bombers were engaged by 9 Chinese fighters over Zhenru, and 1 Chinese fighter was damaged. On February 22nd, while escorting 3 B-1M3 torpedo bombers, 3 fighters from Kaga operating from Kunda Airfield scored the IJN's first aerial victory when they shot down a Boeing 218 fighter, flown by an American volunteer pilot, Robert Short. Acting on intelligence that the Chinese were planning to mount a counteroffensive, the Japanese bombers carried out attacks on Chinese airfields at Hangzhou and Suzhou between February 23rd and the 26th, destroying a number of planes on the ground. On February 26th, 6 A-1N2 fighters from Hosho, while escorting 9 bombers from Kaga on a bombing raid targeting a Chinese airfield at Hangzhou, engaged 5 Chinese aircraft and shot down 3 of them. The Japanese carriers returned to home waters after a ceasefire was declared on March 3rd. Air crews of Kaga received a special commendation from the commander of the 3rd Fleet, Vice Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura, for their actions. The actions of the Japanese aviators over Shanghai represented the first significant air operations over East Asia, and for the IJN, it also marked the carrier-based combat operations. The attack on Jia Bay was also the most destructive aerial attack on an urban area until the Condor Legion's attack on Guernica 5 years later. Although perceived as insignificant skirmishes, the aerial campaign led Japanese strategists to several conclusions. Although the A-1N2 fighter proved to be inferior in performance to the Boeing 218, the campaign had demonstrated the above-average flying skills of the IJN's pilots and the relative precision of its bombing techniques during clear weather. That leads us up into the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, and from the onset of this until forces were diverted to the Pacific in 1941, naval aircraft played a huge role in Japanese military operations on the Chinese mainland. The IJN had 2 primary responsibilities. First, to support amphibious operations on the Chinese coast, and second, to carry out strategic aerial bombardment of Chinese cities. This was unique in naval history, as it was the very first time that any naval air service had ever carried out such an effort. The campaign started initially in 1937, taking place largely in the Yangtze River Basin with attacks on Chinese nationalist military installations along the coast by Japanese carrier aircraft. Naval involvement reached its peak in 1938 to 1939 with the ferocious bombardment of cities deep in the Chinese interior by land-based medium bombers, and concluded during 1941 with an attempt by tactical aircraft, both carrier and land-based, to cut communication and transportation routes in southern China. Although the 1937 to 1941 air offensives failed in their political and psychological aims, they reduced the flow of strategic material to China, improving the Japanese military situation in the central and southern parts of the country for a time. The Second Sino-Japanese War was truly important to Japanese naval aviation, showing that aircraft could contribute to the projection of naval power ashore. Despite fierce rivalry between the Japanese Army and Navy, in the fall of 1937, General Matsui Iwane, the Army general in command of the Chinese theater, admitted the superiority of the naval air services. His combat troops largely relied on the Navy for air support. Naval bombers such as the Mitsubishi G3M and Mitsubishi G4M were used to extensively bomb Chinese cities. Japanese fighters, notably the Mitsubishi Zero, were able to swiftly gain tactical air superiority, giving control of the skies over China to the Japanese. Unlike other naval air forces, the IJNAS was responsible for strategic bombing and operated long-range bombers. Japanese strategic bombing was mostly employed against large Chinese cities like Shanghai, Wuhan, and Chongqing, which were struck by some 5,000 raids from February 1938 to August of 1943. The bombing of Nanjing and Guangzhou, which began on September 22nd and 23rd of 1937, caused widespread international protest, culminating in a resolution by the Far Eastern Advisory Committee of the League of Nations. Now we move into the Pacific War. At the beginning of the Pacific War, the IJN possessed the most powerful carrier force in the world, through a combination of excellent ships, well-designed aircraft, and superior aviators. The Navy Air Service consisted of 5 naval air fleets. The Japanese possessed a total of 10 aircraft carriers, 6 fleet carriers, 3 smaller carriers, and 1 training carrier. The 11th Air Fleet contained most of the IJN's land-based strike craft. A crucial advantage held by Japanese naval aviation at the onset of the war was the ability to effectively amass carrier air power. In April of 1941, the first air fleet was created, concentrating the IJN's carriers into a single powerful striking unit. The Kido Butai was the first air fleet's operational component. At the start of the war, 3 carrier divisions made up the Kido Butai and were an operational entity, unlike the carrier divisions of the United States Navy, which served only in an administrative capacity. The 2 carriers in each division fought together, often exchanging aircraft squadrons and commanders on strikes as the situation required. The commander of the Kido Butai could command the combined aircraft of its 3 divisions as a single entity, launching massed airstrikes conducted by highly trained aviators at a single target. In 1941, the IJNAS had over 3,089 aircraft, along with over 1,500 carrier-based pilots and 370 trainers. There were 1,830 first-line aircraft, including 660 fighters, which included 350 Mitsubishi Zeros, 330 carrier-based strike aircraft, 240 land-based twin-engine bombers, and 520 seaplanes and flying boats, which included fighters and reconnaissance aircraft. During the first 6 months of the Pacific War, Japanese naval air power achieved incredible success and spearheaded offensive operations against Allied forces across the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, the IJN's Kido Butai attacked Pearl Harbor, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet and destroying over 188 American aircraft at the cost of 29 planes lost. On December 10th, Japanese naval land-based bombers operating from bases in Indochina sank HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, the first time that capital ships were sunk by aerial attack while underway. In April of 1942, the Indian Ocean Raid drove the Royal Navy from Southeast Asia. There were also air raids carried out on the Philippines and Darwin in northern Australia. In these battles, the Japanese veterans of the Chinese War performed well against inexperienced Allied pilots flying obsolete aircraft. However, this advantage would not last long. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, and again in the Guadalcanal campaign, the Japanese lost hundreds of veteran pilots. Because the Japanese pilot training program was unable to increase its production rate throughout the war, those veterans could not be replaced, contributing to an irreversible erosion of Japanese air strength in the Pacific. Conversely, American pilot training programs were able to continually produce well-trained pilots throughout the war in continually increasing numbers. The American aircraft industry was also able to rapidly produce new aircraft designs that rendered their Japanese opponents obsolete in combat. Examination of crashed or captured Japanese aircraft revealed that they achieved their superior range and maneuverability by forgoing cockpit armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Flight tests showed that they lost maneuverability at high speeds. American pilots were trained to take advantage of these weaknesses. Outdated Japanese aircraft, piloted by increasingly lower quality aircrew, suffered great losses in air engagements from late 1942 onward, particularly at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. By late 1944, Japanese naval air strength had been effectively crippled, with the First Air Fleet acting only as a decoy during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October. Following the naval battle at Leyte, remnants of Japanese naval aviation were limited to land-based operations, increasingly characterized by kamikaze attacks on American invasion fleets in a last-ditch effort to turn the tide of the war. This, however, would not work. From December 16, 1941 to March 20, 1945, IJN aviation casualties were 14,242 aircrew and 1,579 officers killed in action. The aircraft carrier's paint had barely finished drying by the time she'd first see action. She was the largest Japan had built at the time, and she was a glimmering beacon of hope as she entered the war, hoping to turn the tides in Japan's favor. An American submarine would dash these hopes, lurking in the water like a great white. On this Sunday's episode of Shipwreck Sunday, we get into the story of Shinano.